Hi there, and welcome to a new episode of Extreme Banding, the slow YouTube camera channel dealing with various photographic nightmares. I am living in one of them right now, December in the north of Sweden. Weather is so-so, and the sun never rises. There's no time or place for photography, so what can you do? Think about which all-mechanical rangefinder camera with a cost below 1,000 euros you would like to use for the rest of your life, perhaps.
Hi there and welcome to another episode of Extreme Banding. As stated in the Contax video, the Soviets combined the Contax lens mount with the Leica shutter in 1949 with their TS VVS. And in 1950, Zeiss Stuttgart made a smaller version of the Contax 2. There was, however, a camera maker who did both these things already in 1948. As you have probably figured out already, we are talking about Nikon. Nikon was an optical manufacturer from the beginning and had, for example, made lenses for Canon's early rangefinder cameras. When they decided to make a camera, they went for a different path than Canon and most other Japanese camera makers who did Leica copies. Nikon instead went the Contax path, at least partly. Nikon's first camera, the Nikon 1, basically looked like the camera in front of you. As we went through in the Minolta video, the Minolta 35 with a superior 4:3 format was released in 1947 and Nikon followed in their footsteps. But since Kodak had decided on 3x2 and 36x24 and were very powerful, Nikon and Minolta cameras were not allowed to be imported to the US. Because of this, Nikon released the Nikon M in 1950 with a 34x24 format, but with 36 images, so it would be compatible with Kodak's automatic film cutting machines and thereby allowed to be imported. Very few of these first two versions were produced, but then in 1951 the camera you see before you now was released, the Nikon S. As far as I know, the only change to the Nikon M was the built-in flash sync and the name. As you can see, Nikon chose to be inspired by the look of the Contax while addressing some of its weaknesses. They chose a Leica style focal plane shutter as well as a simpler rangefinder mechanism. They kept the Contax mount with its internal and external bayonet as well as the finger focusing wheel and the removable back. Already from the beginning with a fixed take-up spool, some 30 years before the Contax received it with the Kiev 4 AM. The shutter design was ahead of the Leica variants in a way, as it had the slow speeds at the top in a dial around the fast speed dial. A better location in my opinion than on the Leicas, who left the slow speed dial on the front until the M3 in 1954. Shutter speeds went from 1/500 of a second to 1 second. To access the slow speeds you go for the 20 and then you just rotate this dial to the correct time. There. Pretty easy. So a simpler and therefore you could say more reliable shutter and a more repairable rangefinder mechanism. Nikon also said goodbye to the Contax grip by reducing the base length to 60 millimeters. Compare here to the Kiev 4. So you can see how easy it is to block this window. So you're really forced to keep the Contax grip as it should, while on the Nikon this area is free. So reducing this length was of course good for the ergonomics, but you still had to wanted to use some kind of variant of the Contax grip, since you had this finger focusing wheel. But if you had a lens with external bayonet mount, of course, that would not be needed. They did make the camera a little bit smaller than the Contax 2, or here the Key of 4, which is, a tiny bit smaller than the Contax 2. So the difference is a bit less. The Contax 2 is maybe this tall. A little bit less wide, a little bit shorter. It is almost the exact dimension as the Contax 2A, which was released 2 years after the original Nikon camera. And this one measures 135 times 78, and the base plate is 31 millimeters. The Nikon S is a very heavy camera though, weighing in at 642 grams. So if we compare it to the Contax 2A, you can see that the size is about the same. The 2A is a bit more nimble perhaps, but if you measure them from top to bottom you get the same dimensions. But the Nikon weighs 100 grams more. But I would say, despite the weight, the Nikon is nice in hand. It is nicer than the Contax 2A, I think. Mostly because the Contax has the shutter button here and a bit wider base length, but mostly the placement of the shutter button, while the Nikon has the shutter button in the Barnack place, you could say, and this makes gripping the camera easier. You just get a better grip when your fingers get to claw around the winding knob like this. So I would say it is in a way a consumer Contax with slower top speed, less precise shutter. There goes the non-fixed take-up spool. As you can see, of course, the shutter of the Contax 2A is a beauty. And here you can also see the smaller frame size of the S. It has cloth instead of metal curtains, and you can say it has less precise focusing with the shorter base length, but the end result is quite nice. The lens mount is the same as the Contax, but Nikon had the reverse issue of the Soviets when making lenses for their camera. The Soviets made lenses from the size Contax standard. The Nikons, as they started out by making lenses for Canon, which was Leica thread mount, they made lenses for the Leica standard. But when Nikon chose the Contax mount, they kept the Leica standard. And when the Soviets did their Leica screw mount cameras, they kept the size standard. I did make a video, the first one on this channel, about this subject, and I will have to do the obligatory I was wrong video later on, as I have now tested this with a live view rangefinder camera, the only way to truly test it, and there is a difference. So what happens then? If you use a Contax lens on a Nikon camera body, if you focus correctly in the rangefinder, the focus point, if you're close, let's say 1 meter, the focus point will be a couple of centimeters behind where you focus. And the reverse, if you use a Nikon lens on a Contax camera and you focus correctly in the rangefinder at 1 meter, the focus will be a couple of centimeters in the front of where you focus. This gradually disappears as you get closer to infinity, but if you're at 1 meter, it is a good thing to know, so you can compensate for it. I think it's, you shouldn't say that they're incompatible. You just have to know about it so you can compensate. If you have a Contax lens on your Nikon camera and you're doing a portrait at 1 meter, you should maybe put your focus on the tip of the nose. And if you're using a Nikon lens on a Contax or Kiev camera, you should maybe put the focus on the ears. But that is only if you are shooting wide open. As almost all older 50mm lenses focus shift to the back, you should always be aware of that when using a rangefinder camera. And that is no matter the lens camera combination, and especially at close distances. I would say this is a bigger factor than the size Leica difference in focusing. but for wide open shooting, it's good to know. Well then, reduced base length and, a smaller window. But let's have a look at the Viewfinder rangefinder in practice. Here's the Viewfinder rangefinder of the Nikon S. And it has, many times you suspect the Japanese of copying the Germans, but in the case of the Nikon S and Contax 2A, it seems like it was the other way around. It has, exactly the same magnification as the Contax 2A at about 0.65 times. The effective base is about 39 millimeters, so similar to the Leica 2 Model D and many other cameras, perfectly sufficient for 50 millimeters. And it is not a 3x2 finder, more like a 4x3 finder, as that is the film format. Compared to the Contax 2A, besides from the different format and difference in base length, I would say I like the image in the Nikon S better. It is a bit darker but has better contrast, and I would say for me it is a slightly nicer image. I mean, it's not anything that tips the scale to one or the other camera really, but it is something to be noted. So the 4:3 format is in one way a downside of the Nikon S, but at the same time, it is kind of good to get a different way of seeing images sometimes. So this is an alternative for that. And there are quite a few external finders with a 4:3 format made for digital compact cameras that you can find relatively cheap. The accessory shoe of the Nikon S is a bit offset from the center, so you might get more parallax error. But on the upside, it is very close to the viewfinder window. So shifting between focusing and an external finder is very quick and nice. The shoe is also further back than on the Contaxes. You can see here, or even more telling here. That means you can use most external finders on it, like this metal Voigtlander, which is really doesn't protrude at all. Quite nice on the Nikon S. They could have made the winding and rewinding knobs a bit taller for easier use. It's not that much to grab a hold of, but the grip would probably have suffered a bit from that. All in all, I would say the Nikon S is a very nice camera. It is nice in hand, even though it is a bit heavy, and it is quite easy to focus with a good rangefinder patch. As I do not use longer lenses than 50mm and seldom need shutter speed faster than 1/500, I actually prefer the Nikon S to the Contax Kiev cameras. Except for maybe the Contax One then, but that is a special case. As a normal user camera, the Nikon S is a wiser choice. So, ahead of the mighty Contax in ergonomics, take-up spools, and basically on par in build quality, what would come next from Nikon? Well, along came the year of 1954, when Leica shocked its competitors with the M3. In the Soviet Union, the Kiev factory kept producing Contax 2 copies, and the KMZ factory moved the slow speeds to the top of their Sorky 3M. Canon still made bottom loaders, now with geometric shutter speeds and 1,000 of a second top speed in the Canon 4 SP2. Their advancements paled in front of the new M3, as did all other camera makers' efforts. But I would say that Nikon was probably closest with their brand new Nikon S2. The Nikon S2 kept the same size as the Nikon S, but the weight was reduced with 100 grams to 540 grams. A lever wind was added, as well as a rewind lever. The shutter now went from 1,000 of a second to 1 second. Still a rotating speed dial though, with slow speeds still on a separate color. You just go to 130 and then you can shift it. The speed dial was changed to one of these lift-off variants, maybe premiered by the Canons, as opposed to the non-lift-off design of the S. And this has the advantage that you can see what shutter time you have set both before and after winding the shutter. The accessory shoe was moved more to the center, but also a bit more to the front. There. Film format was also changed to the standard 36 by 24. And even though I like the Nikon S, I must say that this is a rare case when almost every upgrade was to the camera's benefit, and they kept all of the things that worked, almost. While the winding knob on the S is good, the lever on the S2 is better. It is not as nice as the nicest winding levers, but still very good. The camera is nicer in hand than the S with the reduced weight, but still feels every bit like a quality camera. And it is actually really nice to hold. The rotating speed dial should not be a problem, as the shutter button is quite a bit taller. And then of course we have the viewfinder, which was also a big upgrade. And here's the viewfinder of the Nikon S2, and it is beautiful finder. 1:1 magnification and 60mm effective base length. It has a big and very contrasty rangefinder patch of the old style, not this layered type, and is very easy to focus. The viewfinder overall has a nice feel to it. The tint is a bit yellow maybe, and gives a very nice feeling. Not as bright as the brightest, but nice and bright anyhow, and still keeping good contrast. The frame lines are very nice as they are drawn all the way. Unfortunately, I think they can be a bit faint, at least in this camera, and a bit difficult to see when using the both eyes open technique. Actually, I think this camera is almost easier to use with only one eye open. You can see the frame lines better then, but the side effect is that you won't see anything around them. But having frame lines kinda jump in and out of the image when you're viewing, I think that is a bit more annoying. I mean, that is really the only downside I see to this otherwise beautiful finder. It's just very nice and seems to stand up well to the test of time. I would say that the Nikon S2 is a camera with great ergonomics and a great focusing system with very few downside. One is, as mentioned, that the frame lines could have been stronger and the eye point a bit better, a bit bigger window here. Another thing where I prefer the Nikon S is the placement of the accessory shoe. As it is moved a bit more to the front, some finders, as my favorite ones, the metal Voigtlanders, are not that comfortable to use. They still work, but I think the placement of the shoe on the Nikon S is really preferable if you plan to use external finders. The weaknesses inherited from the Contax, some of them are still there though, such as the long focusing through. And even though it was revolutionary for its time, the Contax bayonet mount is a bit fiddly, especially when removing a lens. Still, I would say the Nikon S2 is a top camera. As the 50s was the golden age for rangefinder cameras, development didn't stop there. In 1956, the Soviets presented their Leningrad to the world. In 1957, Leica launched their M2, and Canon added the L1 to their Canon L lineup. But of course, Nikon had prepared their response. In came the Nikon SP, and with it a plethora of frame lines. Compared to the S2, the SP had grown a little bit in height with a dimension of 135 x 80 x 31 for the base plate, and had added almost 50 grams of weight, weighing in at 587 grams. The camera had received an upgraded shutter with a non-rotating shutter speed dial containing all speeds, like the Contax of the 30s at long last. Shutter curtains were cloth to begin with, but was changed to titanium later on, of course with the benefit of not risking being damaged by the sun. It also received an auto resetting film counter and, unfortunately, I would say, a self-timer. The big thing though was, of course, the viewfinder. The base length remained the same with 60mm and a 1:1 magnification, but parallax correction was added. And on top there is a selector dial for 50, 85, 105 and 135mm frame lines. So already that's 4 of them. Adding to this, Nikon added a second viewfinder window with a 0.4 times magnification containing frame lines for 35mm that are not parallax corrected and a full view of 28mm. It is like having an external viewfinder built in. A very clever move, in my opinion, and something quite original to the SP. As this is a question that is circulating, I think we have to compare the SP to the Leica M3. I think it is a bit strange that they are so often talked about, as they are not more similar than other rangefinder cameras, except for maybe when it comes to the price. And in many ways it is unfair to compare cameras to the Leica M3. Anyhow, let's start with the specification. The weight is more or less the same, with the Leica about 5 grams lighter. The dimensions are also similar, with the Nikon being 3mm taller and the Leica 3mm wider, or something like that. The M3 has a sleeker profile though, with, the Nikon SP having these knobs and dials sticking up, so you can see it's more unstable if you choose to put them upside down. But of course that is more of an aesthetic thing. Both have non-rotating speed dials with speeds from 1 second to 1,000 of a second. I would say the M3's is a bit prettier, but the SP's is a bit easier to adjust. Both also have auto resetting film counters. Effective base length is similar with 63mm for the M3 and 60mm for the SP. And those are the basic similar specs. Film loading perhaps is easier on the SP, but the removable back also can be a bit fiddly, so it's a bit better on the SP, a bit faster, but not that different. The SP has a lever rewind, while the M3 has a knob. This is a plus on the SP when it comes to speed, but the knob on the M3 is still very good and it looks a bit better. So what are the big differences then? Well, let's just start by looking at them as cameras and not being part of systems. First off, the winding. While it is, good on the SP, it is class leading on the M3. The SP is very nice in hand, but not as nice as the M3. The build quality on the SP is very good, but the M3 is just unbeatable in that regard. And that goes for many of the components. The film counter is a bit prettier on the M3 than on the SP, and shutter button feels a bit nicer. Speed selector looks prettier. So you could say that the SP has an advantage in practicality in some features, even though those advantages aren't that big, while the M3 has an advantage in beauty of the same components. The bayonet mount of the M3 is also much easier to use and faster than the one on the SP. You can't focus the M3 with one hand though, so there you have a clear victory for the SP. But surely there must be others. Let us go to, you could say, the big thing in many ways, the viewfinders. Here's the main viewfinder of the Nikon SP, a 1:1 finder with 60mm effective base. Here it is with only the 50mm frame lines. And the weakness of this finder is, as you might know, the rangefinder patch. It is faint, not quite as faint as in this video. It's a bit hard to catch with the digital camera, it seems, but it is much fainter than on the S2. When I received this camera it was not visible at all. I had to dismantle it a bit and clean behind the rangefinder prism, and then it came back. It was also off vertically in calibration, and while the Nikons are not as easy to calibrate as the Leicas, and especially the Barnack style and the followers to those, you know, the Soviet cameras for example, it is at least doable. It is easier than on a Contax. You have to remove the front though. Anyhow, the layered style rangefinder seems to stand the test of time in a worse way than the followers, and while this finder is very bright, I think the layered style finders are often a bit more washed out than the other types. I don't know the compromise, maybe it was that they wanted brightness but had to sacrifice some contrast. Anyhow, that doesn't matter that much when you're at 1:1 and can view it with both eyes open. Then contrast gets really almost as real life, as long as you see the rangefinder patch. The SP of course has a very clever finder system. The eye point is much better than on the S2, so you see these 50mm frame lines clearly and with lots of space around them. And then in this main finder you can also add 85mm and 105mm, and the clever thing here is that they're not there at the same time, so you can always use the innermost frame, which it is just easier to do that. And then you have 135, and these are all parallax corrected, so very clever. And if you use 50 you have an uncluttered view, and you can, you know, use all of these with both eyes open if you want to, and they are visible with one eye open or the left eye as well. Adding to that, the SP has something very clever, and that is maybe what it's famous for. It has an additional viewfinder, so you just move your eye to the side like on an old Barnack camera. I think I'm gonna have to set the sharpness here, but you see you just switch over like that. So here's the viewfinder at about 0.4 times magnification with a drawn line with parallax markings for 35mm, and the whole image is 28mm. So you have a lot of different finder options built into the Nikon SP. And I think I'm really a fan of drawn frame lines. It does have the downside though, that it is very difficult, at least for me, to use the whole frame, as the 35mm frame lines are so prominent. Very good for composing though for 35mm. The problem is that switching between these two, you probably get used to it, but switching from a big and bright finder to a small and dark finder, your eye also have to refocus a bit. It's kind of a letdown when you get to the smaller, darker finder at first, if you compare to having a Barnack and switching between just a small rangefinder window to a big and bright external finder. That, at least to me, it has a better feel. But I think if you use it much with 35mm lenses, I guess you would get used to it, just focusing on the rangefinder patch in the main window and then going over to this for composing, which I think it is really good for. The weakness is still a bit in the rangefinder patch still. So we can increase the brightness here as well to make it more comparable to the S and S2.
as the SP. The main finder is just brighter than the other ones. So there you have it, the wonderful viewfinder of the Nikon SP. And so here's the viewfinder of the Leica M3 as a reference, and this is with a 50mm frame lens and 0.91 times magnified finder, 63mm effective base length. So it beats the Nikon on the base length part, and as you can see, the rangefinder patch is extremely nice and visible, and focusing is super easy. The frame lines are extremely bright and visible. The viewfinder in itself is maybe not the brightest, as it has a very bluish tint, but that also makes the patch and frame lines extremely visible. I would say for 50mm this is almost unbeatable. You can use it with both eyes open, but not as easily as on the Nikons. It takes some effort to align the images. I don't use it with both eyes open. And the 90mm frame lines are also very good. Probably the best camera for use with 90mm lenses. And then you have the 135, which is a bit small on this camera as well, but very visible if you want to use that. But using anything wider than 50, well, of course you can, but if you want to have good framing, 50 is about the limit for the M3 without external finders. It should also be noted that it is, as I've said, not the brightest finder, but the sun is quickly descending now, so it might have gotten a bit darker than before. If I set it to the same settings as on the S and S2, we have this kind of brightness, and compared to the SP and S3 we are here. So there you have it for comparison, the wonderful viewfinder rangefinder of the Leica M3.
Well, the SP is brighter, but contrast and rangefinder patch are better on the Leica. And the finder of the M3 is really unbeatable in what it does. For 50, 90 and 135, I think the M3 is better than the SP. The SP is easier to use with both eyes open though, so if that is your preference, the SP is the winner. Eye point is about the same, and you can see the M3 has a larger window at the back. The SP doesn't look that strong in that regard, but eye point is still pretty good. The M3 has a very slightly longer base length. Adding to that though, the SP with its high magnification finder can suffer a bit from rangefinder shift. And that is that the focusing point of the rangefinder shifts a little if you look at it from off axis, if you're not, exactly straight on. And this happens to all rangefinder cameras I have tested except for the Leica Ms. So along with the much better rangefinder patch on the M3, focusing accuracy is in favor of the Leica. But here's the deal. The Nikon SP also has a separate finder for 28 and 35mm, which the M3 just doesn't. We really do not have to get deeper into that. We can just conclude that the SP is better for those focal lengths. Of course, the M3 has goggled 35mm lenses you can put on. I have not tried those, and if the image quality doesn't take a big hit in the viewfinder, the view should be very good. But the goggles do look cumbersome. As for external finders, I think a protruding finder, a finder that is not like this but goes a bit to the back, is better on both of these cameras. Finders such as this one, they are not that nice on Leica Ms for some reason. You kind of have to bend forwards to get a good view like you do on a Nikon, for example. Not as much, but they're not a perfect fit, and Leica's own external finders from the time do go out a bit to the back. The M3 viewfinder also has a bit of a problem that it outshines many external finders. So that is actually, a bit of a downside when using external finders. You want the external finder to be better than the internal. Another thing I have a bit of a problem with on the Leica, and this is of course very personal, is that it feels so dense that I get a bit worried that it will smash into something when I have it in my coat pocket. Feels like a wrecking ball, but the only resulting wreck would be the camera itself. It is probably just me being a bit sensitive to luxurious items. But even though the SP isn't exactly your common rangefinder camera, I feel a bit safer walking around with it. As for shutter sounds, 1000 of a second M3 SP. The pitch is a bit higher on the Leica and a bit lower on the Nikon, but I think shutter sounds, they are pretty similar, even though the Nikon has a titanium shutter. They are both very good in that regard. So that pretty much sums up my feelings about these two as cameras. If you add things as lens selection, repairability, ease of reselling, this of course tips the scale over quite heavily to the M3. I mean, the Leica Ms are compatible with lenses from the 30s up to this day, making it the most versatile lens mount available. It can even mount Nikon lenses with the right adapter. And then, the Nikon lenses work just as good as on the Nikon cameras, but these adapters are quite pricey. But if you like the look of the Nikon, prefer a 1-to-1 finder, or want to shoot 35 or 28 millimeters without an external finder or goggles, the SP will always be a better choice. Personally, I also prefer the SP 35mm finder to the 35mm frame lines in the 0.72 times magnified Leica cameras, but I do not think that is the common perception. And as always, some do not want to have a Leica camera, but still want to use rangefinders, and then the Nikons are very good alternatives. Nikon would manage to release one more rangefinder camera before they put a mirror box on the SP and killed off rangefinder cameras altogether with the Nikon F in 1959. In 1958, they released the Nikon S3, often referred to as a budget version of the SP. But I am not sure I feel that way. It has the exact same dimensions as the SP, weighing a mere 10 grams less. Everything is really the same, besides from the finder. A clue to the difference can be seen here, as the rear window is much bigger. But before we look at the finder more closely, we will compare the S3 to another camera. 1 year after the S3, Canon released the quite similarly spec'd Canon P. So we will now compare these two in what we could call the ultimate Japanese rangefinder battle. First off, size. The Canon is 5mm wider and the Nikon is 3mm taller. Canon weighs 20 grams less at 562 grams. Its design is a bit sleeker with a clean line at the top, while the S3 has its knobs and dials. You can do this like a trick on the Canon P. They have the same shutter speeds, auto resetting film counters, etc. Non-rotating knobs with all speeds on top. The lever rewind has a bit better design on the Canon, but function is similar. There are some ergonomic differences to the cameras though. I would say the P is nicer to hold with great ergonomics. The S3 is also good, but the self-timer is a bit in the way and the grip is just not as nice. The S2 without the timer is better than the S3 in my view. The placement of the shutter button is also better on the P, but the S3 is of course adapted to the finger focus and is possible to focus with one hand. The P does feel a bit hollow in comparison though, and the build quality is, in my opinion, nicer on the S3. Feeling in hand is therefore a bit of a toss-up, but I would give it to the Nikon. Now swing open back, which I think is preferable to the removable back of the Nikon. It also has metal shutter curtains, but the S3 is also available in titanium, so there you have the choice between cloth and metal. The shutter sound is a bit more silent on the S3. Here's 125 of a second. Here's 130 of a second. So there you have something of a difference. Winding is nice on both cameras, but the P has a bit of a swooshing sound. Don't know if that can disappear with service, but it's been on all of the Canon Ps I've had. So then, let's compare the viewfinders.
So following the Nikon SP, Nikon released what was supposed to be a more budget-friendly version, at least so they say, the S3. But looking at the viewfinder, it is anything but budget. It is by far the largest viewfinder I've ever seen in a rangefinder camera. I use a 35mm equivalent lens when filming this, and as the finder is 1:1, you can see I have problems getting the whole frame into view as they are 35mm. And it is very bright. This is, the same settings as on the SP, so filmed a stop darker than the S2, for example. It's a bit difficult to catch the rangefinder patch with the camera while managing to get the frame lines into view. It is a lot fainter than on the S2, but better than my SP. Don't know if that is visible here. I'll try to get a better look at it soon. The frame lines are 35, 50 and 85, I think. Not parallax corrected, but they have parallax markings. And compared to the Canon P, which is from the same time, also with 1:1 finder and 35mm and 50 frame lines. On the Canon P I cannot really use the 35mm frame lines, but on this S3 I can. And I think they are quite usable, and you can use both eyes open and see them floating in your vision. So that is a very cool feature. The layered rangefinder patch and a bit washed out contrast is like all of these later Japanese rangefinder cameras. But if you use both eyes open, that won't be too noticeable. The weakness, like on the SP, is the rangefinder patch, but it seems a bit better on this copy, at least fully usable. So I must say I'm really quite impressed by this so-called budget solution from Nikon. One of the better finders out there, especially for 35mm. And if you want to use a 1:1 finder and wear glasses, this is really a good option, as the eyepiece on the back is extremely big. And effective base is still 60mm, of course. Here's the viewfinder of the Canon P then, compared to the Nikon S3. It is a bit more bluish. The rangefinder patch has better contrast, but it is much more difficult to see the 35mm frame lines. So a bit better finder for some things, but clearly worse for 35mm than the Nikon S3. For 50 though, it seems to, if the rangefinder patch is dim, I think it is perfectly usable on the S3, but of course it is a bit better on the Canon. Otherwise, I would say the experience is
quite similar, but the enormous view of the S3 is an experience in itself. Even though the patch is nicer on the P, I would give the victory to the S3. In my opinion, it is one of the best integrated solutions for 35mm in rangefinder cameras from this time. As it is parallax corrected, the P would have the edge for 100mm lenses. The P has one last ace up its sleeve though. It is actually quite nice with all external finders, as the accessory shoe is at the back and also lowered into the body. The distance from the viewfinder window is pretty short, and this is a very nice combination. For me, if price, repairability, reliability of the components and lens selection were not factors to consider, I would prefer the Nikon. If those things were a priority though, I would go for the Canon. So there you have it, my view on the ultimate Japanese rangefinder battle. When looking at the Canon and Nikon cameras of the time, the history of their rivalry becomes apparent. And as I put the S3 versus the P, I think the proper opponent to the SP should really be the 6L instead of the Leica M3. The SP with its 1:1 finder and built-in solution for 35mm was released in 1957. In 1958, Canon released the 6L with its 1:1 finder and built-in solution for 35mm. For the rest, they could argue that they were even more versatile with their auto-parallax compensating external finders. As this comparison goes, the 6L does, from memory, I do not have it anymore, have a little bit more solid feel than the Canon P, and that is in its favor. The main strength of the P compared to the 6L, SP and S3 is the better rangefinder patch, which seems to handle aging better, and the fact that there are many more Ps available. Nikon also released the S4 later on, which was an S3 without the 35mm frame lines, and looks to be nicer to hold since it lacks the self-timer. I think the 35mm frame lines trumps that though, and as the S4 is less common, it is also generally more expensive. But comparing cameras to M3s and Canon Ps is really not the aim of this series. The big question is if I would prefer them to a Barnack. To begin with, I personally prefer the S3 to the SP. The viewfinder on the S3 is really impressive, and I like its 35mm solution better. And the 28mm on the SP is not something I would use either. And before I forget, we will compare the shutter sounds of the Nikons. So here's the titanium at 130 and the cloth on the S3 on 130. SP, S3. Very, very similar. Let's do 1,000 of a second. The pitch is a bit different, but I wouldn't say they differ that much. 1,000 on the S2 and the SP. The SP clearly more silent despite having a titanium shutter. 125 S2 SP. This is more silent. Then we go to the Achilles heel of these more modern designs, the slower speeds. So we can do 130 SP S2, 1/15 of a second. So the SP is better in all regards. And then let's just see about Nikon S 100 and 125. SP S. Let's do 1/500th S SP. Well, I think I prefer the S there actually. Despite these small differences in shutter sound, I prefer the S3 to the SP. But we compare the S3 to a Barnack. When it comes to size, weight and ergonomics, as well as how it feels in hand, I do not think there is much to say. You know, the thinner body of this one combined with how everything is placed, you can't beat that with this camera. The finder could be better in this one though, as you have the built-in 35 and a nice 50, but the Barnacks are extremely well suited for external finders, especially the metal Voigtlander ones. With such a finder mounted, they do get a bit taller, but they are still smaller overall and much lighter. And I usually compress the shoe on these cameras, so it becomes impossible for them to come off. You know, and that is a problem when I try to change external finder, but you know, it's good not having to worry about it. You might feel that they are a bit exposed still and quite expensive, so you don't want them to be damaged, but that goes for these big windows as well. But my favorite Nikon is not the S3, however, it is the S2. It's a bit lighter and doesn't have this self-timer, which for me, when comparing them, I just think the S2 is nicer to hold. Adding to that, the rangefinder patch on the S2 is extremely nice, and therefore I think for me it is my favorite Nikon, perhaps my favorite Japanese rangefinder camera of them all. And with a nice external finder that fits it well, it could be a contender. But I have been through a lot of external finders, and as I really prefer these Voigtlanders, they are what I test cameras with at the moment and the finders I want to use. Unfortunately for the S2, they are not the best match. So compared to the Barnack, I would say the S2 is, while very good, it is worse in hand than this one. It is bigger and not as good with external finders, at least not the ones I prefer to use. So then we are back at the beginning with the Nikon S. Compared to the S2, it seems to be lacking, but it is still a pretty competent camera without any clear weaknesses. Add to that a very nice solution with external finders. You know, this distance, it is shorter than that one. And then suddenly we are closing in on the Barnack. I guess when it comes to cameras, I am a bit backwards. But sitting with this camera a while and shifting between finder windows, I actually think that this is the Nikon I would be most likely to use with wider lenses. I think it is slightly worse in hand compared to the S2 because of the weight, but still better than the SP and S3. The rangefinder patch, while not as big and nice as on the S2, is still very good, and switching to an external finder is actually faster than on the Barnack. Still, though, it is not as nice in hand, and the weight difference is significant, so it doesn't make it all the way. Add lens selection, price, looks, and repairability to that, and it is, in the end, no match for the Barnack. But then again, nothing I've come across is. So, is it all over then? Well, maybe not. Let us get back to the viewfinder of the Nikon SP and S3. Here we have almost unnecessarily bright viewfinders with patches that are a bit faint. As many of you might start to think, well, isn't there a way, an old trick, to make the rangefinder patch more visible by darkening the viewfinder? And of course, you could use, here I have a polarizing plastic. I think the most common way is to use a colored filter over the finder. But if you put this over the viewfinder, it gets a bit darker, could get more contrasty, and the patch could get better. So let's have a look. So here's the Nikon SP in its natural state,
And as I've said earlier, I don't think it's exactly this faint in real life, the patch, but it is clearly one of the fainter ones. So let's put this polarizing plastic over the finder, and as you can see, things greatly improve. You can turn it around for a slightly different tint and maybe even stronger patch. It's a bit underexposed to make this clearer. We will compare the other cameras to this as well. Here's the Canon P on the same settings, and as you can see, it has a stronger rangefinder patch to begin with, and then if we add the plastic here, it becomes even stronger. Now we can choose our level of darkness here. So this works really well on these later Japanese rangefinder cameras, where they're very bright but a bit washed out finders. So the Canon P, it's good from the beginning, but with this it becomes extremely easy to focus. And here yet again is the viewfinder of the Leica M3 with the same settings, and as you can see, the double image is very strong, and so are the frame lines. The image is noticeably darker than the other ones, and this thing with darkening the viewfinder, it really doesn't work to the benefit of cameras who already have a good finder. If you look at this here the double image kind of disappears, and this is no benefit compared to this in my view. And the most common thing is to use colored plastics for this, but as I only had this polarizing plastic right now, I think it works fine. But this not improving the finder, I think it goes for almost every good finder with a good patch, such as the Nikon S2, Soki 5s and 3s, etc. But it's a good thing to know about. As we saw, this can be done with a lot of rangefinder cameras, but these Japanese late ones are really suited for it. Cameras with good finders don't really benefit. So, if you just cut a piece of plastic like this one that I've done on the P here, there as an example, I mean this is just temporary. If you want to do it properly, you should remove the front and make a proper piece and squeeze it shut. If you don't clean the back of the rangefinder prism here, though, this modification will not help you. So the first step is cleaning this. Or I mean, this is easier, so you can do that first. But to get a good patch on the SP, cleaning this is essential. With the Canon P, it's pretty easy to just put something in there from the front. There, eat that. Leica M3. This also has the benefit of making the frame lines a bit clearer, and especially as the viewfinder part with the rangefinder patch gets darker than the auxiliary finder in here, switching between them becomes much nicer in my opinion, which makes the SP a really difficult camera to beat. I think that maybe this is the closest we will get. But aside from the addictive, I must admit, finger focusing, I still do not think it is better than the Barnack. Anyhow, I must say that Nikon, in my opinion, made some of the nicest rangefinder cameras of the 1950s, and they have all my respect, despite what they did in 1959.